Welcome everyone to our webinar on modeling carbon removal in climate policy. My name is David Morrow. I'm the Director of Research here at the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy. I'm very pleased today to be joined by my colleagues and friends, Dr. Raphael Apiening and Garrett Gard, because today is, in a sense, the culmination of a two-year project to enhance the representation of carbon removal in an integrated assessment model. Now, to provide some motivation for the project and a bit of background for those who might not be that familiar with integrated assessment models, I'm going to start with the background of the project. After that, I will turn things over to Raphael and Garrett to tell you about the new model that we've built, GCAM-CDR, and some of the research they've been doing with it. An integrated assessment model, or IAM, is a computer program that combines a lightweight model of the climate system with models of the economy and the energy sector, and often other components like land use or agriculture. And researchers use IAMs to try to answer questions about the requirements of and impacts of climate policies. IAMs are behind graphs like this one that you'll see in major scientific reports about climate change, tracing out sector by sector pathways that we could follow to meet our collective climate goals. IAMs are also behind some of the headlines that you hear when these big climate reports come out. Headlines like, we need to cut our emissions in half by 2030 to keep warming below 1.5 degrees, or we need to get to net zero carbon dioxide emissions by 2050, or a striking claim from the most recent report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, carbon removal is now essential to limiting warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we here at the Institute for Carbon Removal Law and Policy are interested in IAMs for a couple of main reasons. One is that IAMs have played an important role in putting carbon removal, or carbon dioxide removal, CDR, as it's often called, on the climate policy agenda. They've also been very influential in shaping the way that people understand or misunderstand the roles that carbon removal might play in climate policy. And I say misunderstand because, for one thing, it's just very easy to misunderstand and misinterpret the results of IAMs. But also, historically, IAMs have not been great at representing CDR, and especially CDR policy, right? They tend to be limited to just a few ways of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and locking it away, right? And that's what carbon removal is. And they also tend to be quite limited in the kinds of CDR-related policies that they can model. The representation of technologies has been getting better in the last few years, but representations of CDR policies remain fairly limited. So we launched this project to try to help remedy that. And here in a nutshell is what we did. We've created a variant of an integrated assessment model called GCAM, the Global Change Analysis Model, which has been developed over many years by the joint Global Change Research Institute, which is a joint venture between Pacific Northwest National Labs and the University of Maryland. So we took their open source model and we added some new CDR technologies to it and better control over CDR policies and deployment to create a variant of that model called GCAM-CDR. And so at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Garrett to introduce himself, tell you a little bit about GCAM as the PNNL developed it, and then to Raphael to introduce himself and tell you a bit more about what we did to create GCAM-CDR. Then the two of them are going to hit some of the highlights of the research that they've been doing with their models, and I am just going to mute myself and sit back and be super proud of both of these guys. Garrett?
Yeah, hi, my name is Garrett Gard, and I'm a research associate here at the Institute. I guess you can go on to the next slide there. Let's talk a little bit about what GCAM is. GCAM is a global change analysis model, as David already said, and it's on its 5.4 edition. And GCAM is an integrated assessment model that can be used to explore the behavior interactions between 5 systems, namely the energy system, water, land, the economy, and the climate. Relative to other integrated assessment models, GCAM is abundant in a number of technologies of models. GCAM solves markets to get market equilibrium in 5-year time steps, solving from 2020 to 2100, and it uses data from 1990 to 2015 as a calibration. There are 235 different water basins, 284 land use regions, and 32 political regions. And GCAM is a myopic model opposed to an intertemporally optimizing model, which is a lot of jargon to say that GCAM cannot look into the future to optimize prices. Currently, with pre-GCAM-CDR, GCAM's representation of carbon dioxide removal was limited. Direct air capture was recently added to its portfolio, which had already included bioenergy with carbon capture and sequestration, as well as afforestation and reforestation. Control over carbon dioxide removal policy, however, remains relatively limited. And that's where GCAM-CDR comes in. So I'm going to hand it over to Raphael here so he can talk about GCAM-CDR.
Hi, everyone. I'm Raphael Apienin, and I'm also a postdoc researcher at the Institute. And for this slide, I'm just going to walk you through what we've done in terms of the technologies we've included. So we've included 3 variants of CDR technologies, namely direct air capture with CCS. And our representation of DAC is a little bit different from what is currently present in GCAM Core. And we've also included terrestrial enhanced weathering, which involves the crushing of silicates and spreading it on farmlands. And lastly, we have a representation of ocean lining, which involves the spreading of limestone into the ocean. Next slide, please. And this is just a schematic representation of how GCAM, how the technologies are embedded into GCAM. And from the onset of the project, we decided to make some improvements in terms of addressing some of the critiques of the IAM models when it comes to CDR modeling. And one of the key critiques is about the moral hazard and over specification of CDR demand. So in our attempt to model this, we made sure to have a direct competition between the technologies we've introduced with the already existing technologies in GCAM, just to, from a user's perspective, not to over-specify CDR demand. Another important feature we've introduced is the inter-regional trading of CDR, and this can play a key role in answering relevant policies related to spending and investments of CDR, both at a global scale and a regional scale. And this can also be used in terms of addressing inter-regional feasibility of CDR deployment, and then also investments and spending for these technologies. Next slide, please. In addition to the CDR technological improvements, we've also introduced 4 different Cdr policy frameworks to cater for relevant CDR science policy inquiries. And this is one of the major contributions of our work. The reason why, as Dr. Morrow said, there's a lot of misconceptions about CDR, and being able to introduce these CDR policy mechanisms or control over CDR, the user can help avoid some of these pitfalls. And in terms of so the first policy framework we introduced was being able to set CDR demand exogenously, both at a regional and global level. And this approach is very relevant in answering questions like quantity-based government procurements of CDR. And in the second demand source, we have the elastic demand, which is an endogenized representation of demand where there's an intertemporal interaction between CDR demand or CDR scales in response to the carbon price. And the third demand source is known as offset demand, which allows users to set a proportion of mitigating net emissions or greenhouse gas emissions with Cdr technology. And this is a very useful, versatile tool in exploring useful modeling questions like net zero targets, and then also being able to use or allowing the user to have the flexibility of cleaning up residual emissions with this demand source. And then lastly, we have the accumulated demand. The accumulated demand is also useful in terms of addressing questions or modeling cleanup of legacy emissions from a historical perspective. So this graph shows some of the outputs related to some of the outputs related to the CDR policy demand sources. Yeah. Next slide, please. So in leveraging GCAM Core's detailed technological and sectorial representation and our improvements in terms of CDR, technological wider portfolio of technological representation and better control over policy, we're currently exploring questions related to how different CDR portfolio mixes and allocations can affect CDR outcomes. And just a little bit of context, this heat map shows at a global scale how different indicators of CDR perform given different portfolios of CDR, given different technological portfolios of CDR. So B100 here represents a scenario where you have only BECCS. DOT represents a scenario where you have both, direct air capture, ocean enhanced weathering, and terrestrial enhanced weathering. And then B dot represents the full portfolio. And as I mentioned, due to the versatility of the demand sources, we can also model normative allocations of CDR technology, such as the ECPC, which represents the equitable cumulative distribution of CDR based on per capita emissions, and then AP, which represents the ability to pay. And as you can see here, these different, on a technological basis and also on the portfolio mix and allocations, we see some differences in terms of the performance or outcomes of the SDG indicators. Next slide, please. On the next slide shows how different allocation mechanisms affect the SDG, performance of SDG outcomes at a regional level. And as you can see here, the equitable distribution of CDR technologies on a per capita basis, right, can help alleviate or enhance some sustainability impacts of CDR technologies in vulnerable regions like Sub-Saharan Africa, in terms of reducing the population at risk of hunger and their reliance on traditional biofuels. I'll hand over to Garrett in the next slide.
So here's some of the research that I've been helping to lead on that takes advantage of GCAM-CDR's capability to use an offset demand source. So here we use that offset demand to link the deployment of CDR to emissions from hard-to-abate sectors. The electricity sector was given a mid-century net zero constraint, so carbon prices across sectors rose until electricity emissions hit net zero. The remaining emitters are what we would consider hard to abate, as the constraint on electricity emissions did not stop them from emitting. Post the net zero year, carbon prices were left static through till the end of the century. So the motivation behind all of this is to have a look in, CDR gets a lot of attention because of its place in, or its probable capability of offsetting demand from those hard to abate sectors. And so getting those hard to abate sectors involved that mid-century electricity net zero goal. The graph on the left shows the emissions from hard to abate sectors in two different energy demand scenarios. The top scenario is GCAM's baseline energy demand assumptions, which we consider as high energy demand. The bottom scenario is calibrated such that energy demand is congruent with Grubler et al.'s 2018 paper, which provided a scenario in which 1.5 degrees was met without negative emissions technologies. On the right graph are the associated CDR demands for those scenarios. As is apparent, lower energy demand results in less residual emissions from hard to abate sectors, which thus leads to less CDR demand. I should also say these results are from an earlier version of the model where ocean enhanced weathering becomes the dominant form of CDR. In the newly released version of GCAM-CDR, there are parameters that better capture the constraints on OEW and make competition between CDR less cost sensitive, as cost is not the only factor that limits the deployment of technologies. And I think it's worth pointing out that this kind of highlights a flaw is probably the wrong word, but a sensitivity in a lot of models to be very cost sensitive and cost optimized, where you can see that one technology will take over without taking non-cost factors into consideration for the constraints. Now, it should be noted that with this research, with these scenarios in this research, it doesn't necessarily mean that CDR is 100% requisite to offsetting emissions in even low energy demand futures. What this is saying is that this particular model, GCAM-CDR, says that CDR is needed when CDR demand is linked to hard to abate emissions. And we can go ahead to the next slide. So in reference to that point about CDR not necessarily being 100% requisite, you can see that under a more ambitious climate policy, we will have lower residual emissions, resulting in a lower demand for CDR. These two graphs are both high energy demand scenarios, but the one on the left includes a carbon price that increases by 5% annually every year after the net zero year. While the graph on the right is the same residual emissions as the previous slide, where the carbon price stays static after the net zero year. I'll conclude and summarize this section of the research and of this presentation by saying the point of this is relatively simple. The amount of CDR needed will be affected by energy demand and climate policy. We won't need that much CDR if energy demand is reduced and we pursue aggressive climate policy. On the other hand, if energy demand remains high and climate policy is relatively lax, this model shows that this will result in higher demand for CDR late in the century. And I think we're going to turn it back over to Raphael so we can talk about some of our GCAM USA stuff.
CDR will play an important role in achieving both near and long-term mitigation strategies in the US. In the last few months, we've been working on implementing the capabilities of GCAM-CDR in the context of the long-term mitigation strategy for the US. And the results shown in this, on this slide, shows the distribution of CDR across these 4 new technologies. And in the next slide, Garrett will explain what is driving this, but I mean, the representation here, right? The distribution of CDR essentially reflects the explicit state level dynamics of technological opportunities and resource constraints here. So I'll pass this on to Garrett to give a detailed explanation.
Unmuted. I was saying that these are some very cool graphs that Raphael helped make and that show some of the calibration and the distribution of the mineral trade within GCAM-CDR. So when porting GCAM-CDR to USA at a higher resolution for USA specific modeling, one of the important limitations that informs the modeling of CDR in the US is the distribution of mineral resources that are required in the production of terrestrially enhanced weathering and ocean enhanced weathering. To understand the potential flow of trade, of mineral trade associated with CDR in the United States, we calibrated the production to reflect states' relative capacity for basalt and limestone production, which are the 2 main inputs into terrestrially enhanced weathering and ocean enhanced weathering. The circular Sankey diagram on the left shows the flow of limestone to and from regions, and the Sankey diagram on the right does the same with basalt. You can see in the diagram on the right that states like New Jersey, Oregon, and Virginia produce a lot of basalt in order to calibrate, in order to calibrate for spatial limitations, the distance between producers and consumers of minerals was added as a cost. So even though New Jersey is relatively basalt abundant, they are not going to be supplying basalt to Nevada. The diagram on the left shows some interesting interactions as well. Here, the flow of limestone is split into grids, but there are some relevant state level details that should be pointed out as well. Obviously, coastal states with large ports are going to be larger consumers of OEW, as shipping will be used as a distribution method for lime. Noting this, Florida, California, and Texas become the largest consumers of limestone, yet some of the largest producers become Pennsylvania, Illinois, and West Virginia, which are notably big coal-producing states. This kind of economic and material flow can provide insights into pathways for just transition, as coal-producing states can shift to limestone production, given a CDR market that generates demand for ocean-enhanced weathering. And that's all I have on that. I can pass it on to whoever should be speaking next.
All right, thanks. Before we turn to Q&A, I want to make one sort of substantive remark and then a few announcements. For Q&A, we will be using the Q&A feature on Zoom, so go ahead and type your questions into that Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to answer as many of them as we can here. Questions that we don't get to answer here, we can answer in writing when we post this webinar to our website. So the substantive remark I want to make here is that it's about the interpretation of IAM results. And there's this temptation to think of IAMs as crystal balls, right? As predictions, as telling the future, or as automatically telling us what has to happen. And this is, well, this is not right? There are what-if machines that can be used to explore questions, but the results need to be interpreted thoughtfully. And so I want to sort of leave you here with 2 sayings in the modeling community that I think are particularly important. One is that models are for insights, not numbers. Most of these results should not be taken literally, especially from just one study, because you've got to ask yourself and understand what are the assumptions behind them, what's being left out, what are the alternatives, and the sort of key question is what can we actually infer from the model's behavior, right? What is it really telling us? And that requires quite a bit of sort of familiarity with the model. The other saying here is horses for courses. It's a bit more obscure, but the idea here is that the same horse that wins the Kentucky Derby is often not going to win the Belmont Stakes. Some horses are better on some courses than others. Likewise, some models are better for answering some kinds of questions than others. GCAM in particular is best for studying long-term climate policy questions. So GCAM-CDR is helpful for thinking about the kinds of questions that Raphael and Garrett had just been talking about, right? What are the long-run implications for SDGs of doing CDR or not doing CDR, or doing it this way or that way? What about long-term demand for CDR to neutralize residual emissions? If the kind of question you want to ask is, what does the 45Q tax credit mean for direct air capture in the next 5 years? GCAM is not the model for you. Right? It's just the time steps are too large. It's not what it's designed to do. We are very excited to announce that GCAM-CDR is now publicly available. It is on GitHub. It is open source. You can download it. You can use it. You can modify it. You can do what you want with it. Documentation for using it is also on GitHub at that repository. But I will warn you that if you don't already know how to use GCAM, it's going to be of limited help. Right? Fortunately, the people that make GCAM put on a meeting every year, a GCAM community modeling meeting, where they will teach you how to use GCAM. And the meeting is coming up June 7th through 9th. It will be a virtual meeting this year. You can find the registration page on Google, GCAM Community Modeling Meeting 2022. And I believe registration, at least for US citizens, closes June 5th. We would be remiss not to acknowledge our gratitude to our sponsors here. The GCAM-CDR project and related research is primarily funded by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, with additional support from the Climate Pathfinders Foundation. We are grateful to both of those funders. And if you would like to get in touch with us about the model, I'll leave all of our contact information here. If you are interested in learning more about it or getting help with it or collaborating with us on research. I'll leave this up for just a moment in case anyone wants to jot things down as we turn to Q&A. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded. And so if you have to jump off early, we will post the recording to our website there, carbonremoval.info, once we have it captioned and cleaned up. Thank you very much. And I'm going to stop sharing and turn to some of these questions. Okay, so we've got a question here about how the demand for CDR gets spread across the 32 geopolitical regions in GCAM. And in particular, was there consideration of the regions or countries being at different development stages? And so having different abilities to decarbonize, set up markets for CDR, et cetera. I suspect both of you guys have quite a bit to say about this. See, Raphael is writing an answer out already. Garrett, do you want to start saying something about this?
Yeah, so for the hard-to-abate sectors, research that was done for that scenario design, the 32 regions were split into OECD and non-OECD countries. So the constraint on the electricity sector to get to net zero was set to 2040 for OECD countries and to 2060 for non-OECD countries. I will say the ability to decarbonize across economies is affected by their calibration. So even like within that one OECD market that is being constrained to hit net neutral emissions by 2040, the rate at which countries do that is going to be different. It's not like everybody's going to have the same pathway, despite OECD being clumped into one region that's set to 2040 and non-OECD being clumped into another that's set to hit net zero in 2060. sure Rafael has some stuff to say on that too. Yeah.
So in the context of my research, first and foremost, I want to clarify the work is couched as a thought experiment, right? It's a computational thought experiment. And due to that premise, for the portfolio designs, we try to keep CDR equal, right? In terms of the regional CDR demand equal. So in my case, I didn't cluster them into OECD, non-OECD. I kept, for the portfolio design, I kept the CDR equivalent to the B100 setup, right? I mean, the regional demand at, for B100. And the point is that we're trying to understand how, if one technology or a portfolio of technologies, right, replace one, I mean, just a single technology, how does it affect the SDG implications? So it's a thought experimental thought experiment. And as such, due to the versatility of GCAM-CDR, where you can model exogenous demand, I was able to kind of implement that. And then when it comes to the normative CDR distribution, I used, I use ideas from burden sharing, climate burden sharing of emissions. And this has also been implemented in terms of CDR distribution. So I just use the same literature to kind of distribute the temporal CDR demand across the 32 regions. Yeah. And that's why you see some variations here.
I would add to that a more general point about the way GCAM-CDR sort of distributes CDR demand across regions. At least when you've enabled interregional trade in CDR, that comes with an initial weighting of where the CDR demand sort of goes, right, to which countries or regions it gets allocated. And that weighting is based on total greenhouse gas emissions from each region in reference scenarios. No climate policy scenario is not quite right, but no new climate policy scenario. And the thought there is that total greenhouse gas emissions reflect a lot of the things that are likely to determine countries' capacity to do CDR and some of these other things that the questioner mentioned, right? Stage of development and so on. And so it gives you a sort of initial distribution. You saw that too in the GCAM USA results that we were shown. And then there are other factors that come in, right? Like which regions can do it more cheaply and so on, which will also be affected by stage of development and the rest of that. So there's the sort of general point about the default behavior of GCAM-CDR, which is designed to avoid the sort of undesirable result that if you put a bunch of demand into the model, say Central America and China end up doing the same amount of CDR, right? You don't want that. And so the model is designed to avoid that by default. But then there are these extra layers that Garrett and Raphael talked about of scenario design. Okay, we've got a question that we can pretty quickly answer, I think, about using agricultural soil-based CDR. This is something we'd initially hoped to do in the model. It is extremely hard to parameterize across all of the many, many different agricultural regions in GCAM. It is, I'm pleased to say, something that the GCAM core developers are working on. Jay Furman, who's here and has done a lot of great work there, adding DAC to GCAM 5.4, is, I believe, working on that too. Raphael, do you want to talk about the assumptions for future CDR cost development and where those cost curves come from?
Okay, so in terms of the cost dynamics, one thing we did was, first and foremost, we scoured a lot of literature to get insights into the upper bound and lower bound estimates. And that's what we use in terms of the modeling, in terms of modeling it. Yeah, basically most CDR technologies are, I mean, they're not mature technologies, so we definitely have to rely on literature to get a good sense of what are the cost estimates. And then in terms of temporal dynamics, one thing we did was we introduced a cost curve, which is analogous to what technical change, like technical improvement. So the assumption here is that as time goes, with the progression of time, these technologies will, the deployment of these technologies will improve, and this will come with it associated cost declines. So that's how we implemented it. And I think Garrett made a point about GCAM not being, the cost is not endogenous. So this is specified exogenously. So yeah. Thank you.
Let's see here. So we've got a question about the history of modeling CDR in IAMs, and in particular, why early IAMs so heavily privileged BECCS. And the really short answer there is it's easy to model BECCS and it's harder to put this other stuff into the model. Right? It's the short answer. In fact, with GCAM, as we've discovered, even when you try to tell it not to do BECCS, it wants to do it anyway. Right? So there are these various mechanisms by which this technology-rich model knows that, say, biomass can be converted into biogas, and it knows that you could run a gas-fired power plant with CCS. And just the way the solution algorithm works, it can end up diverting a lot of bioenergy into CCS that way, right? Which is one way to put the point that BECCS is easy to model, the other stuff is harder. An important but related point is that BECCS is part of the energy system, and the models already had a model of the energy system. They already had all the sort of infrastructure from a coding and technical perspective inside the model to think about how much BECCS would get done, right? And then CDR is just a consequence of that amount of bioenergy with CCS. And trying to think hard and get the model to do what you want with respect to demand for other kinds of CDR is actually a lot harder, right? So I mentioned Jay Furman's excellent work on DAC. It took a long time for him to get that into the model. And so not just GCAM, but other models are starting to catch up to this and confronting the challenges of both modeling the technologies well, given the high uncertainty surrounding them, and thinking about how CDR policy ought to work in the model. Okay, let's see here. Raphael, do you want to talk about this question about the relative volume of ocean liming and enhanced weathering in the GCAM USA stuff? Well, actually, before you do that, I should say that the GCAM USA results are from a version of the model that is still in development. So the thing you can download on GitHub does not yet have CDR at the state level in USA. We do hope to release that update relatively soon, though. Raphael, do you want to talk about where that comes from?
Yeah. Okay. So the huge, when you look at the map, you see some heterogeneity in terms of the distribution of CDR technologies. And one thing we did was we used GCAM USA, the core version of it, and we introduced some spatial explicit constraints. So one constraint could be, I think Garrett explained this, the availability of silicate deposits. And then we also considered distance, right? So the distance from, let's say, ports to, let's say, the deposit, right? So all taking into account all these constraints like spatial explicit representations, it really affects the dynamics of CDR distribution. And one thing I also want to highlight is that GCAM USA has a detailed representation of the US grid. Yeah. So that also has a bearing on, the cost of electricity, and this can inevitably affect the deployment of BECCS at a regional scale. Yeah. So these are some of the things that impact these results. And I just want to say these are preliminary results, and we are still exploring. Yeah. One thing I can say is that we are getting some interesting insights from this modeling exercise.
Now, one thing I might add to that is that in that scenario, we've assumed, as the long-term strategy does, that no more than 10% of the total mitigation effort between now and net zero in the United States comes from technological CDR. And so it's a relatively small amount in absolute terms, in one sense, right? That is compared to a lot of other IAM scenarios. And the ratio of, say, DAC to other forms of CDR does change as the overall demand for CDR changes. But that was something that struck me too, how the role that relatively small role that DAC plays in the model relative to its interest in current policy discussions.
I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's some states that are kind of, well, like overall, like the US is pretty low on DAC relative to like current investments. There are some states where that's different based on like resource allocation and our calibrations. I think they're less than where like OEW or TW might be dominant, but they're certainly out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I also want to add, the next step is to explore detailed policy relevant. So for example, what if there's, trying to represent the political landscape for investments in DAC. So that'll be our next step, right? Trying to get that representation in terms of the scenario design.
Okay. So we've got a question here about the 4 types of CDR that we consider. And then a particular interest in the idea of taking people who are using traditional biomass and basically try to summarize this here, encourage them to generate measurable biochar for sequestration or use as a soil amendment. And a scale of effort might address some of the just transition issues and so on, and relevant to SDGs. So I might divide that in 2 for the 2 of you. Garrett, if you want to very quickly go over the types of CDR that are in the model currently. And then Raphael, the question about traditional biomass use in biochar seems right up your alley.
Yeah, so before our edition of GCAM-CDR, there was already afforestation and reforestation in BECCS, which finds its way into the model in both obvious and non-obvious ways. We have added direct air capture, ocean enhanced weathering, and TW. TW is also known as like rocks for crops. That's putting basalt or silicate material onto cropland to increase carbon sequestration. OEW, ocean enhanced weathering, is like ocean liming, and then direct air capture. We still have both sorbent and solvent, right? So we have 2 kinds of direct air capture within the model, both sorbent and solvent, which I can pass that to Raphael to talk about the biochar stuff.
So in terms of modeling biochar, the chart of the project, at the beginning of the project, we decided to model it, but as we dug deep into, how to model it, right? And then as I also mentioned, right, one thing we relied heavily on was the literature, like published literature on estimates of input-output requirements for each technology, and then the spatial distribution. One thing we realized was that when it comes to biochar, there was a huge range of uncertainty. And because of that, we decided to kind of put it aside, work on these technologies that had relatively low uncertainty when it comes to the estimate of cost and input-output requirements. Yeah. Hopefully, who knows? Like, hopefully we might work on it in future, but at this moment, yeah, we're running out of time, and we had to take that executive decision of just focusing on technologies that are quite certain from an estimate point of view.
And I would add one thing to that from a sort of CDR policy perspective, which is that these sorts of widely distributed forms of CDR are going to pose serious challenges for measurement, reporting, and verification, right? Which create some obstacles to scaling them up unless you really do get enough local co-benefits from the process, or really benefits from the process and have CDR as a co-benefit. So the policy that drives them is likely to be interestingly different. So we have a question here about GCAM in general. We've referred repeatedly to carbon prices as driving climate policy. What are the other options in GCAM, right? What are the other climate policies available in the model besides carbon pricing? Raphael, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, so I think, okay, so let me just start by saying, when it comes to, they also have constraint-based mechanisms of rationing up technology. So for example, they have a portfolio standard policy where you can set a cap on, a specific technology. That's one of it. And then, I also want to speak in terms of what we've done. So in terms of carbon pricing, one thing we were really particular about, the linkage of carbon pricing is that in our design of GCAM-CDR, you have the ability to kind of remove the coupling of, the scaling of CDR can occur without carbon pricing. Yeah, so this is one other improvement we've included. Yeah. Who else wants to add to this? Yeah.
Well, first, tell them about your the bioenergy ceiling.
Yeah, so I think Jay's not here, but so in terms of one thing, we have an inside joke in the institute where we always say, look, GCAM loves BECCS, or GCAM loves bioenergy. And one thing we've noticed is that once we place a constraint on bioenergy, right, the dynamics of the model output, this is not GCAM core, right? And this is not GCAM-CDR. The dynamics of GCAM changes. The outputs is very huge. And in our scenario designs, we've tried as much as possible to moderate, the scaling of bioenergy. And in the case of my research, one interesting insight I got was that placing a ceiling, right, let's say a gradual scaling of bioenergy, right, actually reduces the burden of improves the ability, right, to reach a 1.5 low overshoot. And this is due to the fact that when you place a ceiling on bioenergy, right, you essentially put a control on terrestrial carbon emissions. And this really enhances, with the additions of engineering CDR, right, you place a limit on it and you're able to kind of mitigate residual emissions. So these are some of the interesting insights. And I also wanted to add, someone asked a question about the history of BECCS. If I'm wrong, I mean, if I might be wrong, but I think BECCS was actually discovered by IAMs, right? So somehow. So yeah, I mean, it was an inevitable discovery where you have bioenergy occurring upstream, or I mean, you have short-term carbon, but then when it's captured, it becomes negative. So these are some of one thing I also wanted to add here. And I think one thing we're able to do in GCAM-CDR, right, is also we've been able to kind of split apart all the various BECCS technologies, and we're able to control it. So in terms of controlling from a competitive point of view, right? So we have a direct competition between BECCS and other engineering CDR. So there's competition in terms of allocation of these technologies, and this essentially reduces the demand for BECCS. And you can also control it by using the portfolio standard approach.
I think it's also just worth saying on this whole BECCS point and like limiting and moderating BECCS at all is it's so hard to do because it's so there's just multiple co-benefits, and you don't see that with like other CDR technologies. Like, you know, DAC is taking energy, but BECCS is providing energy. And so you can have all these land limitations and stuff, but the model, as David was saying earlier, the way it's solved is always going to find a way to, or not always, but it's going to try very, very hard to find a way to both remove carbon and produce electricity. And that can be very difficult to deal with.
I want to circle back for one second to this question of whether there are other climate policies than carbon pricing. Raphael has talked about some of the other options that are embedded in GCAM, which can get quite granular, right? So like you can force early retirement of coal plants and so on, or subsidies to particular low emissions technologies. Excuse me. But it's also worth keeping in mind, going back to the point about models being for insights, not numbers, and not being taken literally, right? Sometimes modelers will talk about carbon pricing as driving climate policy, and it's really just sort of a proxy for strength of climate policy. And it's depending on what you're looking at, not necessarily worth taking that literally. And I think that's particularly relevant for some of these scenarios, right? Where what we want is in one part of the model, there's this background thing that the model is good at solving, and that's carbon pricing that's driving some degree of mitigation. And then we're really focusing the inquiry on something else. Okay, so we've got a question here about DAC and the way GCAM-CDR accounts for the diversion of renewable energy from the grid. So basically using clean energy to power DAC instead of displacing fossil fuel power, for instance. Do either of you want to handle that one? How does GCAM-CDR deal with that?
Currently, the setup is okay, so let me just summarize it a little bit. So currently we just have a direct link between the electricity sector and the various DAC technologies. And I also want to mention our variant of solving DAC has a waste heat approach. So, I mean, if you consider waste heat as renewable technology, I think that's one thing we've included. And besides that, so in terms of driving or scaling DAC with renewable, you can absolutely do it. I mean, GCAM is so flexible in the sense that you can absolutely do it. But for most of the policies we are exploring, they are, I mean, aggressive policies. And with the carbon price, what happens is that most of I mean, once you have a carbon price, most of the electricity, right, becomes low carbon, right? So there isn't any point of doing it. But I remember we're exploring options of just using, I mean, there's that possibility. Let me put it that way. There's that possibility of, just using renewable electricity in the various stack technologies here.
And that kind of fits into the last question, where you can have those specified policies to talk about, like, no new coal at X period. Yeah.
But it is true that if you add a bunch of DAC to the system, right, you are going to increase the electricity demand. Same for OEW and TEW to run, say, crushing, grinding machinery. And that all else being equal, right, that will make it harder to decarbonize the power sector, just because you need to supply more demand. And so I guess the short answer is it handles that the same way that it handles adding any other new source of electricity demand, which is to increase the amount of electricity that needs to be supplied, which can make it harder to provide it all cleanly. All right, I'm going to close with this question here because we're just about at the end of the hour. There's a question about how well the model deals with lifetime risk considerations of various CDR methods. Specific example given is geological storage versus, say, storage in a forest that has the potential to burn before carbon's removed from the biosphere on a time relevant to climate change. So this is the question of durability of removals. And I think there are two things worth pointing out. One is that GCAM does not have built into it feedbacks from the climate system to, say, economic output or land use or agriculture. I believe that's something GCRE is working on, but it's not there yet. And so that just wouldn't be represented in the model, but carbon fluxes from land use change is represented. And so if you have something like a reforestation policy early on, and then you do something later in the model, like lots of BECCS, that is going to change that land use from forest to something else, right? It will capture those emissions. So it's not going to get the natural hazards. It will capture some of the social threats to durability. As we approach the end of the hour, let me just say that we will post this webinar on our website, carbonremoval.info, once we get it captioned. And we look forward to hearing more from you. We gave your email addresses earlier. You can find us on the Institute's website. And thank you all for your attention. See you soon.